Kamala Das, who assumed the name Kamala Suraya after her conversion to Islam, was born in Kerala in 1934. A prominent figure in Malayalam and Indian English literature, Das's Malayalam works were published under the pen name Madhavikutty. Although she mostly wrote poems in English, her other works in the language include the translation of her autobiography, My Story, the novel Alphabet of Lust, and a collection of short stories called Padmavati the Harlot and Other Stories. She went on to win the Sahitya Academy Award in 1985 for her collection of poems in English. A common theme across much of Das's work is the intricacy of human relationships. She expresses her own feelings and emotions with regards to various relationships, which in turn forces her readers to reflect upon their own relationships. Das's works are deeply concerned with the feelings and experiences of women, especially with regard to love and intimacy. The poem, My Mother at 66, explores the feelings of the poet as she thinks about her mother. The poem is an introspective narrative expressing deep emotion in a compact and complex form. It explores the poet's anxieties relating to her mother's old age and possible death. Here is a summary of the poem, My Mother at 66. In the poem, the poet describes her thoughts and emotions while traveling to the airport from her parents' house in Cochin. The poet is accompanied by her 66-year-old mother. On the way to the airport, she looks at her mother, who is dozing beside her in the car. The poet describes her mother's face as colorless, just like the face of a corpse. She realizes that her mother is now quite old, and the thought pains her. She tries to avoid these painful thoughts and turns her attention outside. In contrast to the pale and corpse-like appearance of her mother sleeping inside, she observes the healthy young trees on the roadside, which seem to be running backwards as the car moves ahead. She also sees merry children running out of their homes to play. The poet focuses on them in an effort to avoid thinking about her frail mother. After they reach the airport and the poet completes her security check, she turns around and looks at her mother again. The poet's mother looks frail, pale, and quite old, and reminds the poet of the moon as it appears in late winter. The poet is reminded of her childhood fear, the anxiety of losing or being separated from her mother. The poet is afraid that she might never see her mother alive again. But she doesn't let it show. As she bids farewell to her mother, she only smiles. The two characters in the poem, My Mother at 66, are the poet and her mother. Click each label to know more about the characters. The poet is very attached to her mother. This is evident from the extreme discomfort she feels at the thought of her mother growing old. Even the sight of her mother sleeping seems to be enough to raise fears of her mother's death in the poet's mind. Her attachment to the mother is also clear from the way she does not want her mother to notice her fears. The poet has a deep-seated fear of being abandoned and left alone. This is clear from the manner in which the poet identifies her emotions as an old fear of losing her mother, a fear she had always had in the back of her mind, even as a child. The poet is still hopeful and tries to be positive. This is apparent from the manner in which the poet observes the life in young trees and the energy of the children running around, perhaps in an effort to remind herself that life goes on. She even smiles, albeit for her mother's benefit, giving the reader some hope that despite her childhood fear, she just might see her mother again. The poet's mother is 66 at the time the poem is written, is elderly and exhausted. The poet highlights this throughout the poem by comparing her face to a dying moon and by contrasting her to the youth and vitality of the trees and children the poet sees outside the car window. We can summarize that the poet's mother cares quite a lot for her daughter. This is obvious from the fact that even though she feels ill, she undertakes a long journey only to see her daughter off at the airport. Now let us examine the poem closely. My mother at 66 narrates the poet's feelings during a short ride in a car with her mother. The poet is traveling to the airport at Cochin after returning from a visit to her parents' house. The poet is accompanied by her mother in the drive to the airport. At the end of the poem, the poet and her mother are at the airport where the poet bids her mother farewell. The predominant theme of the poem is the poet's struggle to accept the inevitability that her mother has grown old. The poet is keenly aware of her mother's old age, and she struggles with the fear of her mother's death. Like everyone, the aging of one's parents and their death is a fear that the poet cannot comfortably face. The poem presents the turmoil within the poet's mind as she recognizes her fear of her mother's passing away, a fear that she has nursed since childhood. This is a fear that is common to everyone. Old age and eventual death are inevitable, as the poet realizes, and it must be acknowledged rather than ignored. One must accept the inevitable and smile despite it. The poem also presents a contrast between life and youth on one side and age and death on the other. The young trees which appear to be sprinting and the children spilling out of their homes contrast with the sadness and tiredness of age visible in the poet's mother. This emphasizes that life and death will be ever present within this world. A fear of the future is yet another theme running through the poem. This fear is linked to the fear of loss, as the poet realizes at a very young age the future almost certainly holds the loss of her parents. Another theme that comes through strongly in this poem is that of familial love. The poet is saddened by her mother's old and frail appearance and is troubled by thoughts of her death. The poet's mother, however, does not let her age stand in the way of accompanying her daughter to the airport, thus demonstrating the strong bond they share. The poet uses two very strong similes to highlight her mother's appearance. In these lines, the poet compares her mother's ashen face to that of a corpse, to communicate the fear of her mother's death that is present in the poet's mind. The second simile used by the poet compares the poet's mother to a late winter's moon. The words late and winter serve to emphasize the old and decaying age of the poet's mother, while also, in an indirect manner, expressing the beauty that age possesses through the image of the moon. The poet personifies the trees that she sees outside the window. The young trees are spoken of as sprinting. The poet uses personification to draw a contrast between life and old age. The poet uses young trees and children playing as symbols of youth and continuing life. The imagery of the winter moon serves to present a vivid picture of the poet's mother's age. The poet uses tautology and repetition for emphasis in the last lines of the poem. The words wan, pale, both describing tiredness, are used to really emphasize the appearance of the mother's face. The poet furthermore uses the word smile repeatedly at the end of the poem, trying to draw attention to the turmoil within. She hides her helplessness for the sake of her mother. Now,